There are very few games that can be said to have, if not invented, at least set the structural and stylistic terms for an entire genre. Tetris for puzzle games, Super Mario Bros. For platforming, Metal Gear Solid for stealth. The genre known as survival horror existed before Resident Evil, but the innovations Resident Evil established set the terms permanently for what defined survival horror in the minds of the video game public. But Resident Evil wasn't even supposed to be an original game. It began life as a remake of a 1989 Japan-only Famicom RPG called Sweet Home, now brought into a next-gen world. The license ended up elapsing, but they still took a lot of inspiration from Takeru Fujiwara's 8-bit classic. In Resident Evil, the player picks between two members of a special law enforcement task force, Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, who are trapped in a mansion filled with mutated creatures. It featured polygonal graphics, pre-rendered backdrops, and sharp, fixed, dramatic camera angles, and controlled using what became known as tank controls, where you rotated your character in place and then pushed them in a specific direction to move. You traveled through the mansion with limited ammunition, collecting documents to expand the game's world and clues to help solve puzzles throughout. Where most games would give you an option to just shoot your way out of every situation, Resident Evil made it a point to limit accessible ammunition, to tell you that sometimes the right answer is to just run away. Resident Evil was a seismic hit, selling huge numbers and garnering praise from across the spectrum. And Capcom put Resident Evil 2 into production less than a month after the first game's release. The structure was the same, but they focused on expanding the scope of the game and its narrative, making the presentation more theatrical and building the lore of the nefarious Umbrella Corporation, running out of Raccoon City and growing outside the mansion to cover the entire urban sprawl, centering around a police department building, focused on a rookie police officer named Leon Kennedy, as well as Claire Redfield, the college student sister of original game protagonist Chris Redfield. Resident Evil 2 was, if anything, even more acclaimed than Resident Evil. It maintained some of the same criticized quirks, the restrictive tank controls, the goofy little puzzles, the cheesy voice acting, but so thoroughly expanded the good things, with vivid graphics, intense audio, spooky atmosphere, and a compelling narrative. After this, Capcom put multiple Resident Evil projects into motion. Ignoring a fairly maligned and forgotten first-person shooter called Resident Evil Survivor, two more traditional follow-ups were in production. One was intended to be a spin-off side story featuring original game protagonist Jill Valentine, showing what she was going through during the events of RE2. The other was intended to be a direct mainline sequel to 2 that got moved up to the new Dreamcast hardware. The problem was that Sony reportedly had established exclusive rights to the title Resident Evil 3 for a PlayStation-only release. So the shorter, less involved, Jill-specific side story game became elevated to direct numbered sequel as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And the intended full, extravagant mainline sequel for the Dreamcast was instead renamed Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica follows Claire Redfield as she gets arrested after traveling to Paris to raid an Umbrella Corporation facility searching for her brother Chris. As the game begins, your captor has let you out of jail, because there's been a T-virus outbreak on the island. She meets up with another inmate named Steve, who is also trying to escape and survive, especially while running across the island's mentally unstable commander, Alfred Ashford. Whereas the first Resident Evil games evoked the gritty urban horror of American B pictures, Code Veronica has a more operatic, gothic, European atmosphere, embodied by initial antagonist Alfred, who inhabits a split personality where he becomes his own sister, a sister who, spoilers, also happens to be cryogenically frozen on a base in Antarctica, really expanding the series' settings. Disc 2 also puts us with Chris, who arrives on the island just as Claire leaves. And through a lot of drama, we're introduced to Albert Wesker, Chris's former boss who hadn't appeared since the first game, but very much becomes a major part of Resident Evil lore in the ensuing decades. Here, he's less the primary antagonist and mostly a mercenary wildcard, working sometimes with and sometimes against Chris's intentions. Even better than the story is the visuals, which are frequently astonishing, with a high polygon count during cutscenes that sometimes look like something from years later. Code Veronica was promoted as the true sequel to RE2, and they stated their intentions were to sell around 1 million copies. But the initial pre-order totaled more like 400,000. Like several other games, the game was intended to make a big splash as an American Dreamcast launch title on 9/9/99. But, like so many of those other games, technical issues caused delays that pushed the game into the year 2000. And sales reflected the limitations of the Dreamcast's user base. It sold excellently compared to other Dreamcast games, but looked weak compared to previous entries in the Resident Evil series. This was despite universal acclaim, considered arguably the best Resident Evil game ever made on release, and considered arguably the best game on the system, even above Soul Calibur in some places. To try and get more exposure for this excellent game, they ported it over to the PlayStation 2 as Code Veronica X, with a little bit of new footage. But the game's reputation has always seemed to be colored by its unclear, sort of nebulous place in the canon. As far as my personal take on Code Veronica, it is classic Resident Evil in basically every way. Yes, the tank controls are awkward, sure, the puzzles are goofy and borderline inscrutable at times. Of course, you're gonna die over and over and over trying to fight through the zombie horde. But it's dramatically compelling in ways that video games rarely were, especially back then. And I spent my childhood grinding through RE2 and RE3. So even though it was unequivocally frustrating, that frustration felt like a warm blanket of childhood nostalgia. It just feels right to be playing. The atmosphere is impeccable, the narrative is involving, the graphics are gorgeous. There's never a time playing an old-school Resident Evil game that I'm not happy to be playing it. Because of the weird confusion between RE3 on the widely released PS1 and Code Veronica being stuck on the dying Dreamcast, the latter has never seemed to quite get the flowers it deserves. But it's a valuable and essential part of the Resident Evil story. And if you've never played it, and you're into this old-school style, you owe it to yourself to take a trip to Rockford Island. Next time, when the financial troubles are as extreme as the bloodshed, chances are Paul Heyman's involved.